But the question is, what does that mean for the rest of my life? Because we still have this experience of the post-fall reality that my life feels divided. It feels like I do the worship thing when I go to church on Sunday, or I do the recreation and leisure thing when I'm like hanging out with my family for the 1 hour on Sunday afternoon that my kids aren't climbing up the walls and driving me absolutely nuts.
Your kids?
Well, kids generally. I'm speaking as the everyman here.
Okay.
And then the rest of my life is just like drudgery and toil. It is that punishment from the fall that God inflicted upon Adam after he fell.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Logos Podcast. This is Deacon Max.
This is Deacon Joey.
And on today's episode, we got a recurring guest, still special though, special nonetheless, Matt Hylom.
What's up, guys? Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I like the fact that I'm a recurring guest now. This is my second time.
This is how things happen, This is how projects develop.
Yeah, Matt, the only problem with having you on the show is that when we have a guest right now, I have to stand a lot closer to Deacon Max, and it makes my life a little bit more...
That's tough.
Penitential, I'd say. So I guess I'm growing in holiness in that respect, but...
It's what I do, really. I make people grow in holiness. I'm like a light that just kind of rubs off on things and just magnifies the Lord in a lot of what I do. And Matt, you're the same way in your work.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, why don't I introduce the episode, and then we'll refresh our listeners on who Matt Hylom is. So this is Logos Podcast. Welcome. Glad you're here. Deacon Max and I are deacons studying to be priests in the Catholic Church. And our podcast is all about introducing you, our listeners, to the Logos.
And introducing ourselves.
And trying to grow closer to the Logos ourselves. That's a great point. I should say that more when I introduce the podcast.
Humility.
Yes. But we talk about all sorts of stuff like philosophy, theology, art, literature, culture, that type of thing. And that is part of why we have the guest on that we do. So Matt Hylom, if you go back, what was our last episode with him titled?
I think it was called Creativity, like the power of creativity or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
The need for the creative. Because Matt Hylom is actually, would you consider yourself a music producer?
Singer-songwriter producer.
Yeah, singer-songwriter producer. And he has stuff on YouTube. You can check him out on Spotify. Apple, MySpace is a classic. It's my classic. I don't know if it's a classic. iHeartRadio. Yes. I'm sure it's
Snail mail.
AOL.com. I mean, dial-up really is really the way we should go here. I don't even know what that is. Even a platform? No. So anyway, Matt Hylom, he is a friend of ours, and he also has a lot of insights regarding kind of the creative field, but also philosophy and theology in his own right, as a married man, as a father, and as an artist. And so he has his own production work, but he also, like any rational being, thinks about things, and especially influences the way that he works. And as we'll talk about, also the way that he leisures. And that's actually kind of the topic for today, the relationship between work and leisure, fragmentation and integration. I mean, that's kind of the way we're gonna approach this topic. But do you want to introduce yourself in any way? Say anything about yourself, Matt Hylom, and maybe aspirations for this episode itself.
I am a singer-songwriter producer, and that's it.
Sick.
Father, husband, father, 5 kids, Catholic. That's it.
Are you Catholic, Deacon?
But
I'm trying to be.
Okay.
Yeah, we're all trying to be. As it relates to the episode, though, I was thinking about. I started reading the Leisure Basis of Culture this year, and one of the things I heard y'all's podcast on it, and one of the things that you mentioned, Deacon Joey, you mentioned my name about somebody who might struggle with the distinction between the music I write and leisure. As in, my art being either a source of leisure or a source of work because I do this for a living. Yeah. And that kind of that has been present to me for a long time, that problem, because I got into music because I love it. And then once it became work, then that distinction started to blur and started raising a lot of questions in my mind. Like, well, how does one thing turn from work to leisure or vice versa? And that kind of led me down this rabbit hole of trying to really sort that out in myself regarding music, but then my whole life. I've been like, well, if something can turn into work and feel like it's a burden, when I came into this and it was so leisureful, the things that I see as a burden now in my life, can they return in a way back to something that's more gratifying. And so that's where this whole thing started to spring up from.
Yeah, and I'd say we talk in our podcast a lot about the importance of leisure. I mean,
We've done multiple episodes.
Exactly, and things related to it. And even our episode with you, to some extent, Matt, had some of those kind of underpinnings under it. But as you're saying, that question does remain. And I was telling these guys that I gave a talk on leisure a couple of years ago, and there was this kind of older man just sitting in the back, just kind of maybe accidentally entered into the conference. And there I am quoting Joseph Pieper, who I'm sure he's very familiar with. But it was just funny because he asked me at the end, he goes, well, can you not leisure and mow the lawn? So it's this question, like, what about work?
Which is a really deep question.
It is. Like, it's a simplistic question, but it's profound. It's like this very thing. So we talk about leisure a lot, but the question does become, what about work? Does it have no place whatsoever in a life of integration, a life of holiness?
Yeah, and of course, this question, Matt, is particularly acute in your life because for a living, you do what a lot of people would categorize as like a leisureful activity, right? You create music, and so you're wrestling with it in a kind of unique way. But I think the question that you're posing to us, and this is actually, when you proposed this episode kind of topic to us, I thought it was great because it was something that we addressed kind of towards the end of our previous episodes on leisure, but it's worth diving more fully into. It's this, okay, if leisure is so important for my life, and which Deacon Max and I and the Christian tradition would say is true. You need rest, you need leisure, you need to contemplate the higher things, you need to engage in human activities that are not just productive and efficient and for the sake of furthering the economy. That if that's true, then what do I make of the vast majority of my time, which is spent working, right? Like, does my life just become about trying to get through and like suffer through my 9-to-5 job so that I can have some time to quote unquote leisure on the weekends?
Just so that I can come back renewed to work again?
Right.
So like
it's one of those things, like even as a father of 5, most of my time is spent, dealing with children and raising them and busybody around the house. And so it kind of, this is something Pieper mentions too, is that seeing leisure as this kind of break from regular work and then go back to the real world after leisure still kind of frames the world as like a work world. And so is there a way that leisure then informs the world I go back to such that it's completely transformed?
Yeah, there's this emphasis I know in just Ratzinger brings it up all the time in his theology, and I think it's a reminder of kind of the Christian idea, and we've brought it up a lot. But yeah, is the world primarily something that we are engaging in a worldview of work, or is it something that we're entering into as a view of gift? Right. So that's as you're saying, it's not just.
Yeah, is the world raw material for me to manipulate and produce things out of, or is it something that I've been given that I'm supposed to first receive in wonder?
And that's largely what the kind of the Enlightenment movement and the scientific revolution in general, 16th, 17th century emphasized. It's like, I need to take the material world and instrumentalize it into reaching the particular ends that I have in mind for myself.
Yep.
They're best for society, best for my family, most convenient to me individually. Whereas a Christian view is like, no, actually it turns out leisure, being, is a primacy of existence. We take in what happens, right? And we do it for a particular end, not just convenience or power or some sort of kind of satisfaction, maybe even in our work. But we do it to glorify God. And we'll get into that kind of as we talk about. But there is this tension, nevertheless, always between leisure and work, because of the reality in which we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and that, the Christian tradition, while it does place the primacy of gift and receptivity and thanksgiving for existence at the top kind of the totem pole, it doesn't discount the importance of work, right? It doesn't say that work is and producing and creating things is therefore unimportant. And I think that's kind of the question we're going to try to answer. So how should we understand this relationship in our lives in a theoretical way, but then in a very practical way? Like how are we going to try to live this out in a day-to-day way, this relationship between work and leisure? So Matt, when we brought this up, when we started kind of having this conversation initially, you thought that it would be wise to frame the conversation within the larger context of what you called the exitus reditus.
Which comes from St. Thomas Aquinas.
No, it's totally Matt.
It's your origin. My bad.
He made it up.
Sorry, I thought
Yeah.
that was something else.
But I
It's
guess my
Thomas
question
Aquinas,
is, help us
the,
just
the
like unpack
Dionysius.
why, like, yeah, what that is, and then like why you think that is an important way to frame the discussion.
So the idea of exitus and reditus, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
is the idea that God creates the world and then man, as the final act of creation, is then to bring all of that creation back to God.
Right. So the kind of cycle goes, God the Father creates the world. Then we have, like we would take the Old Testament, the prophets, right? And then comes who? Jesus Christ, the God-man, right? And what does he institute? He institutes the church and the sacraments as patterns back to the Father, right? So how do we enter? So exitus, the creation comes from God. Reditus, we return to God in the name of Jesus Christ. So that's kind of more or less the structure there of that
Right.
idea.
But even in the garden, the idea was
Correct.
that creation was supposed to be something that Adam then returns back to the Father. Like that was his act of worship is in naming and ordering. And so that exitus and reditus was already there.
Yeah,
From
so
the beginning.
and yeah, Deacon Max mentioned that St. Thomas Aquinas, he actually his entire Summa Theologia is patterned after this pattern. He says that God is the first origin of all things. Mm-hmm. Everything comes forth from God, but that God is also the final end of all things. Like that that not only human beings, but in a sense, all of creation has an end, has a telos or a telos is the Greek word for end, that is it's like the purpose for which it existed. It's the end towards which it is always moving, and ultimately it is for creation to glorify and ultimately return back to God in an act of gratitude and love and thanksgiving for the gift of itself. And so that concept is very profound and is very beautiful. And I think it does. I think, Matt, you're right. It does help us understand. It helps us situate this discussion about work and leisure, because in the Garden of Eden, when God created humanity, you said this was already at play. Adam and Eve's job, like what their vocation, was to
Cultivate the earth.
Facilitate this reditus, right? Like be instruments in the highest instruments, right? Because they're part of the material creation, but they're also spiritual beings, and so they can take the material creation and with their freedom and creativity offer it back to God the Father, right?
But there wasn't a tension between work and leisure. There wasn't two kind of duplicitous or fragmented worldviews.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, let's
Right?
try to understand that the relationship between work and leisure in the garden. What would we say about that?
It seems like they were one and the same. Right, because if leisure is how does Pieper describe it? He says that leisure is to time what the temple is to space. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so the temple or the church is the place that is set apart for worshiping God. Right? So it's made holy, right? It's separate.
That's right.
So that we can return back to God. It's the place where that happens, where God meets humanity and we ascend the mountain, however you want to frame it. And so prior to the fall, there was no place where God wasn't.
Yeah.
And so that temple was creation.
Yeah, there was no temple. The temple was creation
Right. So
itself.
that means any act of work, any act of return was worship. They were completely synthesized.
Which is it's kind of a radical concept. And I think this is the first step towards understanding the role of work in our own lives. It's to recognize, that work existed in the Garden of Eden, right? Like even Adam and Eve in paradise, it wasn't like they just had their feet up and were relaxing and like reading all day, right? They were actually
Cultivating
the earth, till and keep the earth. This is what God commanded them to do. But they were doing it, as Matt, you just said, in such a way that it was that all of it was an act of love and worship and thanksgiving to God, even in and through their work, in such a way it wasn't yet the toil and the drudgery that work is now after the fall, right?
Yeah.
It was an expression of their love for the Father and a means by which they offered their lives and all of creation back to him by like ordering it and making it beautiful.
And just to define leisure again for those who are unfamiliar, I think it'd be helpful. Leisure here we're talking about, Joseph Pieper characterizes it as a disposition of the soul that is ready to embrace reality, right? So this relationship between work and leisure in Adam and Eve, they had a disposition of the soul. They were moved by grace, right? To take the created order and offer it to God. And as you're pointing out, and I really like your point about this when we talked the other day, Matt, like all of that changed after the fall. Like work was, food was earned by the sweat of the brow after the fall, right? The pains of labor, the work of the woman to bring a child into the earth was painful and was work after the fall. Right. So elaborate on this whole kind of, right, at the beginning of creation, we had leisure and work, let's say, integrated.
United.
Right? And then after the fall, there's the splitting of this, which is what we're experiencing still today. Even in our little podcast platform, we see this tension arise.
I think one of the ways we can kind of step aside from this talk of leisure, but as thinking of leisure as worship, we can kind of paint a little bit more of the picture.
Yeah.
In that, let's say, post-fall, everything we do is ordered towards something.
Yeah.
Right? Everything is a ready-to towards something, and you can call it a lower God or a higher God, right? So there's this hierarchy of things and ideals that we strive for, things that we do because of a particular goal. Those are all little ready-to's to some sort of thing, right? So I'll give you an example. This is something that
can we coin that term, ready-to's? I like that.
Yes, I like to make adjectives and plurals of everything that's not supposed to be, but but so this came up in discussion with my wife. We were talking about eating at the table and the meal times, and I said there is a way that you can just see how we come together for lunch or breakfast, dinner, etc., as just means of sustenance.
Yep.
Right? Like I'm just here to get some food so I can go back to my work, right? I'm here to grab a quick bite or whatever, and then I got to go do the real
I'm going to go
thing,
heat up the cold Chipotle because I got to go back in the studio.
Exactly. And so that action, right, of eating lunch is a type of ready-to's, right, to the God of sustenance. Let's just this is kind of a poetic painting of this. Okay. Now, so I posed the question. I said, when we gather for a meal, is there a way that we can gather for a higher ideal, right? Like a higher God, if you will. Obviously, it's going to be God himself, but it's like, is there something like community or relationship with the other people at the table that we actually are gathering here for? And the work that we do leads to these moments and not the other way around. Right? And so this is now a reordering of the things I do, the work post-fall, so that it's properly aligned with the highest ideal, right? So this is now I'm bringing that work that could be outside, that could be disordered because it's for just a lower ideal. I'm now bringing that into a higher mode of being, right? And this is to Pieper's point, this leisure disposition will inform how I then treat lunch, for example.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really good. So so St. Thomas Aquinas will say that human beings, we act for the sake of an end, right? Mm-hmm. This is another way of saying exactly what you just said. We all have these little ready-to's. These are the ends for which we act, and we act for multiple ends at a time. So like you were saying, I can, why do I get up out of bed in the morning?
Yeah.
Well, the immediate end is because I need to start my day. I need to start.
I got to get to work.
Yeah. But then okay, that's subordinated to a higher end of why do I need to get to work on time? Well, because I need to keep my job and I need to work hard and make money to feed my family. And of course, that's subordinated to a higher end that we have of ultimately, being able to enjoy my life, have resources, maybe have some time for recreation, and ultimately the highest end that we're all seeking is happiness, right?
Well, and then God, right? So like that's the structure. It's like
Ideally,
exactly. So and this is your point though, right, Matt? So like, where are our structure of ideals? And is at the top God?
and before the fall, God was at the top.
Correct.
So before the fall, everything that Adam and Eve did, all of the little ends that they were pursuing, were perfectly subordinated to and oriented towards their ultimate end, which was God. And which is why leisure and work, or worship and work, were almost completely one in them, because everything they were doing, even their small act of eating a meal together, was ultimately oriented towards, yes, their sustenance, yes, their community life, but ultimately towards the glorification of God, ultimately towards facilitating that reditus.
Yeah.
But then after the fall, they're cut off from God. Right? There's now a divide between them and God, and they have a false
And them in themselves.
and them in themselves, right? So they're disordered within themselves, but they also are cut off from what is highest. And so what they start putting at the top, towards which they're orienting their little redituses, right, is something that's not God.
Yeah.
It's some created good that is less than what will ultimately satisfy them.
Yeah, and touch in on this. I know the other day when we were talking, you brought up something kind of in passing, but I found it particularly profound. You said that also one of the effects of the fall is losing our identity as a child of God, right? And I bring this up because in the first notation of the rule of Saint Benedict, right? Which I don't know if you know Saint Benedict.
I've heard of it.
You heard of the guy Saint Benedict before? You heard of the guy? There we go. Saint Benedict, he starts off by saying, "Listen, O son, to the words of your master." Right. So, because why? He does that. This is a 5th and 6th century saint we're talking about, who's leading these group of men who are, by the way, their life is focused around work and prayer. We could say work and a form of leisure, right? Because he's trying to instantiate in that group of men that their role in the ordered world is to actually first reclaim their identity as beloved children of God, who are to take the created world, enter into it, into the dynamic of its difficulty even, so as to be able to enter it into the leisureful life that they live in their work, but also their scheduled prayer, their scheduled time of dinners, right? Their scheduled time of masses. Because it's like you said, there's this idea, this view that as a beloved child of God, I am called to enter into his life. And entering into his life is one that, yes, as we were talking about, God creates, he works, right? But then on the 7th day, he also rests, right?
Right.
So entering into that
Yeah.
integrated life.
Yeah, I think bringing up St. Benedict is a really good point, because the ora et labora, pray and work phrase is very helpful with this, because so lest this become too conflated, that it's like, is now eating lunch leisure, or is washing the dishes leisure, as opposed to worship at mass or reading literature, or etc. Those things aren't the same. The idea is that you're implementing a pattern into work that has been given to you, that you receive when you actually go off and create a separate space for leisure, right? So when post-fall, when Adam and Eve are out of the garden, God then has to come down and tell them the way they should worship, right? This is what Exodus is basically unfolding, the idea of the temple, right? God comes down and says, this is how you are going to worship me. And so he's giving the pattern, right? This is not something that is like, oh, just remember that you have community when you eat lunch. It's not something you just kind of spring up and create yourself. You're not supposed to create this meaning. This meaning comes down from above. And the way to find that is to go to the sacred place in your prayer, ultimately at Mass, and receive the pattern, which you then go out and implement into your life.
And it has to come down from above, because after the fall, we don't have the capacity to climb our way back up, right? So Adam and Eve and all of their descendants after the fall, up until, Exodus, let's say, there's this disintegration in their lives. They're pursuing all these other gods, all these other created goods in such a way that when they sit down at the table, all of their activity is not oriented towards their ultimate end. It's oriented towards some subordinate end, which ultimately is in competition with these other ends that are in their lives, and that's going to create a divide between them.
And this is a case, we're using salvation history as an example, but I mean this is a case in our own lives. I mean this kind of lack of integration still very much exists, and in Jesus Christ, then all of a sudden we see, as you're talking about, like the pattern, we talked about this, right? So like man is called to pattern himself after the Son, right? Who teaches us something like what is love, right? I mean, it's not abundantly clear as to what that is exactly. Like, okay, I feel some type of way when I'm doing this or doing that or around this person or that person. That's cool. But like in Jesus Christ, we begin to see what reality is. Like, this is what love is. It turns out love is to give yourself sacrificially for the other, out of no other motivation than out of mere desire to be in union with them as close as possible.
Yeah, and so that was revealed to us from above, which there was no other way for that to be the case. So now that it has been revealed, now that God has condescended, he's come down and revealed to us the pattern of what true worship, true leisure, true human flourishing looks like, the question becomes, do we just worship now when we go to Mass on Sunday and get in touch with what is highest? Because he's given us this great gift, right? Like we have the true temple, the body of the Lord. We have that place to go to now. We get to climb up the mountain and be with the one who's come down to us and receive from him. But the question is, what does that mean for the rest of my life? Because we still have this experience of the post-fall reality that my life feels divided. It feels like I do the worship thing when I go to church on Sunday, or I do the recreation and leisure thing when I'm like hanging out with my family for the 1 hour on Sunday afternoon that my kids aren't climbing up the walls and driving me absolutely nuts.
Your kids?
Well, kids
My
generally.
kids.
I'm speaking as the everyman here.
Okay.
And then the rest of my life is just like drudgery and toil. It is that punishment from the fall that God inflicted upon Adam after he fell. So now, and Matt, you just hinted at it. It's like, how do we bridge this gap? How do we bring what we do on Sunday, or what we receive from on high, into the rest of our life?
Right. I think that the key is the way Pieper describes leisure as a disposition of the soul. Right. This is not going to be a list of things to do after Mass so that the rest of your day becomes holy. It's going to be, you have to now reframe the very way you see the world.
Yes.
But you can't, that's not just a type of knowledge thing of like, well, if you think about it really hard.
Yeah, it's not just like a
cleaning the dishes
change, right?
actually participates in something glorious. It's like, just think really hard about it. It's like, that's not what we're proposing. It's a complete metanoia. It's a complete seeing differently, seeing like a child, seeing the symbolic relevance of washing the dishes and how that integrates into the whole of your life. And that's wisdom, right? That's philosophy. That's seeing how the parts fit into the whole. And so once we start to notice these patterns in our lives as they relate to the Mass, like as they relate to the proper worship, right? Then that removes the burden of work as toil, right? My burden is easy, right? As Christ says. So once we put on Christ, then the world becomes sanctified in a sense. It becomes all participating in the proper reditus.
Deificative, right? Able to become God.
Yes.
And just a question, it's kind of more speculative, and we don't have to ponder this too much, but I'm wondering if, because that's a good point, right? So the whole idea of like, it's not just a perception change. This is not like cognitive behavior psychology.
It's not just something we can click and change.
So I wonder, because of that, if it's like, that's what we mean by entering into a sacramental vision of reality that is given to us by grace.
Yeah.
Like, we can talk about, thanks be to God, this vision because we've been given it by the tradition of faith of our parents, of us trying to stay close to our Lord in prayer, fasting, of us remaining close to the sacraments and Holy Mass specifically. And so like that opens us up. That, like you said, predisposes. That is one of my critiques of Leisure, the Basis of Culture, is I think he fails to mention that the disposition of the soul isn't just something we do. And he does talk about it's not something we do, but he undermines, I think, the fact of that grace is the thing that opens your soul to be disposed to reality, because reality is founded on the person of Jesus Christ.
I think he does talk about grace in there.
Right.
I think you got to go back and reread it.
Did he?
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
It
I think
stands
that's
to
super
reason.
important.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Joseph Pieper, for my friend.
It does stand to reason
He
that
says
grace.
he's a fan of you, but
I totally forgot that. I was like, did he actually
yeah,
mention
he's got a whole couple pages on
there it
the
is.
primacy of grace in the Christian
that?
tradition.
There we go. There we go.
But okay, this is what I was gonna say. What was I gonna say? Well,
Probably nothing if I had to guess.
we were talking, Matt. You were talking about the Sunday, the worship. Oh yes, okay. So I was just gonna share this experience because hopefully this can help people relate. So I am a seminarian, right? Like I'm studying for the priesthood. So theoretically, like objectively, my life has the capacity to be like ordered towards God in all of its facets, right? Because like I'm doing objectively God type stuff. I am reading theology. I'm going to the chapel to pray. I am spending time with friends in fraternity and like doing stuff like this. But it is possible for me to be doing those things in a disintegrated way, in such a way that I'm reading theology, but instead of being oriented towards God, I'm pursuing some other end. Like I'm going to try to get a good grade on this test and I'm seeking my own glory. And then the disintegration has come in because now this is like work that I have to do and then I'll relegate my time for God later. So it doesn't even matter what you're doing. And this is something that like obviously we have to fight. And you mentioned it, Max. The reason you said grace is so important because the integration that I desire, it's not necessarily something that I'm in control of. It's something that has to happen to me. Like this, Christ has to transform me. I have to be transformed by him. And obviously we have to cooperate with that and avail ourselves of his grace and go to places like the sacraments. But that's like what we seek is little by little in and through Christ being transformed in such a way that when I am either doing something objectively religious, like reading theology or praying, or washing the dishes, all of it is a part of a unified movement back up towards God in love.
In love. And that's the word I wanted to, you brought up, and I wanted you to elaborate on that a little bit, Matt, because you said you think that like the motivation should be charity, should be love in what we do. That's what brings about integration. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah. I think love is that prime motivator that pushes us towards or away from anything. And so, yeah, that has to be central. Obviously, you see that in Dante, how the things that he desires eventually stack up to lead him up to heaven. The point you made, Deacon Joey, about the particular things you do can still, even though if they are at the surface seemingly holy and noble, can still turn sour, is such a huge point because like man is an idol machine, right? That's all we do. We find false gods to worship all the time, and we're always being disintegrated and having to remember ourselves, right? And so, we're talking about leisure and work and reditus, right? All these different ways to describe action, basic action, right? Action towards what is what we're really kind of poking at. And so we're essentially saying our reditus, or our worship of something, if you want to call it worship, our action towards something is always insufficient. And so where do we get the pattern of the perfect sacrifice? That's the Mass, right? So you go to Mass to unite all of your imperfect redituses, right? And then all of that goes through him, with him, and in him, right? That doxology is the moment when all of that is perfected, and then we receive communion, and then go out and then are filled with that new disposition.
Yeah, and Mass is it's a unity of work and leisure because And symbolically, this is portrayed in the offertory rite, right, in the Holy Mass. To our listeners, if you're familiar with the Catholic Mass, part of the Mass includes the offertory, which came in after the Second Vatican Council. Could be brought up by the people. But the point being here that bread symbolizes work and toil, difficulty, suffering. Wine symbolizes joyful occasions, glorious living, celebration. And so we have these two elements come up, right? But wine also and bread also symbolize kind of each other. They both have this relationship of joy and suffering, blood and also celebrations. And what do? They're offered these material things, these creations, these works. It used to be the case where, for example, Mass, families would actually bring pressed bread, unleavened bread to Mass, or pressed wine on their own account to the Holy Mass, and that would be offered, right? Symbolically, though, this means that people are bringing up creation, and who comes down to consume it? God, right? And by the hands of the priest, that's transformed for us to receive his life, to receive him in us, as you're pointing out, to then go back into the created world so as to kind of enter into that ready-to pattern again. But as you're pointing out, that's not something we make. It's something we were given, right? And it's something that, as Joey pointed out earlier, something that we enter into, a dynamic that we have the gift of living out. Now, post-fall, right? That's the space.
Yeah.
Where we meet God.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of Romans 12, verses 1 through 2. St. Paul says, I urge you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, your spiritual worship. St. Paul is he saying that you should literally go and commit human sacrifice and mutilate yourself?
That's what I've been trying to talk about. Like the Aztecs, they were onto something with the ripping out of the heart. That's what I'm saying? Like, I'm just saying, nobody ever talks about that.
Just because you're Mexican doesn't mean you can start getting into all that crazy stuff.
God, oh my! Lift up your hearts.
Well, what he means is that you're supposed to make of your entire life an offering to the Father through Jesus Christ, right? And this is exemplified. This is ultimately what we're trying to do. Yeah. And the human person, is fulfilled in love. Matt, you talked about the primacy of love. All of these little gods that we're pursuing because we love them. There is some goodness in them that we perceive, and it's the impulse of love within us that is driving us towards them. But we're never going to be set totally free until the love that is within us and for which we've been created is channeled towards the highest good, which is God. And if you look at the lives of the saints, this is exactly what you see, right? It's people who, I'm thinking of Saint Therese of Lisieux, one of my favorite saints, and her little way. It's kind of talked about in like a cute way, like, oh, anyone can be holy if you just like smile and try. No, like Saint Therese was offering her body as a living sacrifice in every single thing that she did. She lived in a cloistered monastery for her whole life, never left its walls, and did simple tasks like folding laundry, knitting, living in community with her sisters. But every single thing that she did was, I would say, leisure. It was like, she had this disposition of soul by which she was offering herself back to God the Father.
And even in her death.
Yeah, and especially in her
right?
death.
She was able to, embrace Jesus Christ as she would see him get closer to her. She was open to this, even as she was suffering. Is leukemia? Tuberculosis, right? She was suffering, and still she was offering herself up in joy. I mean, this is radical. This is not something you can make. We can make by our own will. I don't know. Do you have anything to elaborate on that, Matt?
Yeah.
I felt like we left you out the last few minutes.
Yeah. The idea that you have to offer up your body, right? We can think about what do we mean by body? And that has so many implications, especially for me as a father, right? As the head of my household.
Yeah.
Right? And so my family is part of my body, right? This is, or my art is my body of work.
Yes. Wow.
Right? Everything I do is now part of some integration into where I'm oriented, right? And so these are members of our body that we have to offer up properly. You mentioned too just on the idea of the idol worship, and you mentioned previously whether you're studying theology for the sake of getting a good grade, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Those things are good, But the idea is that we should not rest in them,
Yes.
right? And that they are supposed to be transparent so that we can see the through line to its highest ideal, right? And that's where we rest. And now we're talking about the same thing of leisure, right? So like where did we seventh day, right? Where does this action take its rest and its leisure? Not in getting a good grade, or not just to look good, or for grandeur, or for power, but it's supposed to be transparent, to continue to move, to continue to ascend, as Dante does, right? Through the different realms of hell and purgatory, etc. All the different loves that motivated him higher and higher. All of those things are supposed to lead back to Christ. But that's not to say those things aren't good.
Yes.
But they're supposed to be transparent.
Yeah, they're not goodness itself, right? We would say in the Christian tradition. And I want to talk just really briefly. It made me think of recently we had a talk here on the importance of prayer. Our rector gave a talk, and one of the things he said that I thought was very fascinating. Again, this is for a Catholic audience, but I think this can be the case for anybody. He said, he quoted St. Alphonsus Liguori when he said that, a person could go to Mass for 40 years and still be in a serious state of mortal sin. But a person can't go to prayer very long, a place of rest, let's say.
Mental prayer.
And not have a true conversion. But I think because this idea, like, even in something as sacred as Holy Mass, we can be disintegrated. Our motivations can be misaligned. That's that like famous depiction in Screwtape Letters, or that that book. Like there's the demon is kind of poking at one of the parishioners, saying, "Hey, look what she's wearing. Look what he's wearing. Why are they holding their hands that way? What are they doing that? What time is brunch after this? Oh gosh, I gotta go talk to my wife or my husband or my kids after Mass because I messed up here. I did that. I should have said that." Like there's all of a sudden all this like scattering of the person.
Yeah.
Whereas like leisure properly helps bring us together to like you mentioned earlier, the parts are able to become one in us so that we can become one with God.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. So I'm
There's
thinking
there's
of
also- Yeah, sorry. There's also the on the idea of prayer, like the importance of daily prayer.
yes.
In the fact that it is, in a sense, a fractal version of the week, right? It is your Sunday, right? Starting your day with
Can I also
prayer
just say I'm proud of you for waiting 43 minutes into this thing.
43 minutes before the word fractal came up.
Oh my gosh.
You're influenced by Jonathan Paget. I was thinking maybe 3 or 4 minutes. But this is
Yes, I know. That's a record for me. Yeah. So the idea of prayer, though, is where we get the pattern, right? So like our prayer, without prayer, our day becomes disintegrated.
Yes.
Right. And prayer, again, is not supposed to be this time away to do this particular thing and then you go to real life. It's supposed to inform the rest of your day, right? And so this is something I've been thinking about as well with prayer, worship, and then even my own art, is that all of it seems like it's pattern recognition, right? So
Yep.
prayer is that place where we recognize the pattern. Mass is the place where we recognize the pattern and then go out and implement that pattern afterwards. And pattern comes from the root pater, which is father. So true recognition of the Father, that proper worship, then gets implemented into our world.
And that's interesting too, given, again, going back to worship, leisure, and the Holy Mass, the entire Mass is actually directed to the Father.
Mm-hmm.
Like
The pattern of patterns.
exactly. The pattern of patterns. Exactly. That's the right way to say it. And
Yeah. Sorry to cut you off.
You're really that sorry though? Is the question.
Do you want to finish your thought?
No,
Did have
go ahead.
something else
You
to
know what?
say?
You cut it off. It's gone now. It's gone. See you, thought. See you later, thought.
Then good. I have two thoughts. My first thought is most people actually don't know that. They don't realize that the audience of the Mass is not the congregation sitting in the pews.
Important.
The audience of the Mass is
me.
God.
I'm just kidding. Sorry.
Is God the Father. Okay, that is who we're offering all of the prayers to. So next time you go to Mass, listen to who the priest is talking to for the vast majority of the Mass and the prayers. He's offering God the Son to God the Father, and we are joining him in that offering. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say was a point Matt actually made yesterday, and it's going off of that idea of daily prayer. How, okay, so the goal that we want to do is not to see our lives in this disjointed, divided way, in such a way that, I have my time for work that sucks, and then my time for prayer and leisure, which is fun and good. We want it all to be one. We want to make of our entire lives an offering to God in such a way that even when we're working, we are loving and integrated. Now, there's a temptation to be like, okay, I'm just going to go to work and do that. But hopefully you've intuited through everything that we've said that unless you go up the mountain, right, like Moses, then you're not going to be able to bring that back down. You're not going to bring that pattern back down the mountain and implement it into your life. So you made a great point the other day, Matt, about like we have one day a week, right? Like Sunday every week is the time to reclaim that union with God, be remembered, right? This is my body, do this in remembrance of me, to be remembered in and through Christ so that I can bring that into the rest of my week. And then on a daily basis, that's that time of prayer that I have set aside each day, right? That's so essential. And then you made this beautiful point yesterday, sorry to just steal your thunder, but I'm just going to say it, about the whole liturgical year, right? Like the whole year for Christians is centered around the mysteries of Christ and culminates in the Paschal Triduum and Easter, right? So it's like that is the mountaintop of the year that should inform the rest of our lives so that ultimately all of us can, again, be making this continual offering back to the Father.
I'll say two things. One is that this is something I've been meditating on for a little bit, and I'm still like working on this. But this idea of like, okay, well, maybe I just go find a deeper meaning to everything I do, and I'll have more fulfillment in life if that's what you're really getting at. There's a case to be made that we should find meaning in our life and see how they're connected, but it doesn't come just from us. Right? This is what we've been trying to get at this whole time, that it's something that we receive. This is, I think, something that Jesus in the desert speaks to when he's tempted by Satan to take the stones and turn them into bread. And he's saying, I think there's something there about, can you create meaning on your own? And he says, man does not live on bread alone, by just the connections he can make, but from every word that comes from the mouth of God. Right? And Christ is that bread and that word. And so not only do we make the connections with our intellect and see how they all fit into the whole, but we have to receive something in order for this process to be complete. So I think that's like really vital, lest you become, just like, oh, well, just think really hard about it, and that's going to make it for you.
So let me ask you actually, so a little more concretely too, in your own life and work, which Deacon Joey brought up earlier, like in your own life and work, I mean, part of the reason you're wrestling with this is because you find it in your own reality, like your own creativity. I mean, we've talked about this maybe a little more personal, but you said that like you have your kind of your bread and butter, the money maker, but then you also have this thing that you really want to invest your time and energy into, which is like your own production, right? Your own musical production. And sometimes it's hard because on the one hand, you got to make money. You got a family to feed. You got serious responsibilities. You got that huge house of yours, and that's just robust amounts of whiskey. That is very good, that you got to tend to. But then on the other hand, you have this thing that like you want to create. And it's hard to bring those things together. But then also, like, you're a dad, and you got to go to church, and you got to teach your kid math sometimes, And then you got to take care of your own health. And tend to your wife, And so we talk about this relationship with work and leisure. I guess let me just ask you, as I'm also kind of picking on you, how have you lived this out, man? Like, in your own lives. And I think Joey and I could probably speak to our own lives too, as we have, thanks be to God, this privileged place in seminary to study and pray and do all this stuff. And it can oftentimes become, I got to go to work. I got to go read this chapter because I got class tomorrow, right? Our telos should be, well, we want to be holy men of Jesus Christ, to be good priests, to worship God and bring others into that worship constantly. So, like, in your own life, how do you do it? And then maybe we can elaborate in our own lives how we've found.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. And it alludes to the second point I wanted to bring up, which I'll ask you, Deacon Joey, to mention later, about flow. Because if I were to take all those aspects of my life and try to then think really hard about how they participate in the reditus back to the Father, it's so exhausting to do that at every moment of the day that you would go insane. It requires too much thought, right? So there has to be something like a disposition, an orientation, a type of flowing with the process that has to occur.
You know what's interesting? Aquinas actually says something about that. He says that like basically we would go mad if we constantly try to make distinctions in every moment that we acted.
Absolutely.
So, like,
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So, but there is another way to do that that's more intuitive, right? And the best example for me is like playing music, right? I'm not thinking about all the theory and all the ways that the things fit as they relate to the song. If I'm soloing on the guitar, there's a flow that happens, that all of that kind of goes into the back. However, it's still informed by my orientation towards those things, right? And so I have to go out of my way to practice those things, to experience the pattern, so that when the moment comes, there's a flow that occurs, right? So it's not this constant thinking about how is my math, how in teaching my son math, how am I now participating in proper worship of God? It's just this flow that has to be informed by my daily prayer, my worship, my constant, my reflections on philosophy, my reading. All of those things have to be informing the things that I do, and it doesn't explicitly come out in those things.
Yeah, if you had the intellect of God, you could keep all of this. You could keep well, seriously. I mean, we could keep all of this in and know it in one perfect act of knowing and direct all things towards their end. But we don't have the intellect of God, so we can't like consciously think about
everything all at the same time.
Yeah, and like try to. But so you mentioned this term flow. I'll just elaborate on that a little bit, and then I want to talk about the practice of the presence of God, because I think that is super important for this conversation. So flow is actually, in addition to being a cool word, also like a technical psychological term nowadays. So for part of my pastoral formation here at the seminary, I was asked to do this program called Optimal Work, which I highly recommend to anyone who's able to avail themselves of it. It's put together by this psychologist named Dr. Kevin Majors. I think he's out of Harvard, but he's a Catholic man, great guy. It's not a Catholic program per se, but it's got a lot of principles that are very that fit very well with what we've been talking about today.
Integration. It's kind of an integration.
Yeah, so his goal with the program is to help people approach their work in such a way that it is not draining, but actually life-giving, that they can be energized in and through the work that they're doing, even if it's a tedious, objectively tedious task. Like they can find a way to approach it psychologically in such a way that it gives them life, and they're more energized at the end of it rather than completely drained and exhausted. And it's interesting. So he says a couple of things are necessary for this. The first is, and I didn't talk about this with you guys yesterday, but I'm remembering now. He says before you enter into your work, you should have a moment of rest. He refers to it as mindfulness in like secular terms, but really what it is, it's like a little Sabbath. It's like don't rush from one thing to another. Like before you enter into an activity, actually pause and try to don't do anything. Just be for a moment. Bring your attention to the present moment. And then what he says is, if you can frame what you're about to do in the context of being at the service of your highest ideal or goal, then that highest ideal that you're ultimately pursuing is going to inform your work, and there's actually a psychological state called flow where you're like, time is passing quickly. People have probably experienced it before just on a natural level without even realizing it. Time is passing quickly. You're totally immersed in what you're doing, and you finish reading the chapter or washing the dish. I don't know how often people do this, washing the dishes, but in theory, it's possible washing the dishes. And so this is perfectly in line with what we're saying, because now that's not to say that as I'm reading a chapter, I'm constantly thinking about like something else, like we've been saying, right? I'm not constantly thinking about, okay, I'm going to try to understand this and be worshiping God at the same time right now, because now my attention's divided, and I can't be doing those two things at once. But this is where the practice of the presence of God comes in. So Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, who wrote this book, The Practice of the Presence of God, will just talk about, as often as you can throughout your day, recall the fact that God is within you, that God is present to you. When you're about to engage in an activity, offer it up to Him, right?
You're about to go talk to somebody. I mean, this is a big part of it.
Communion. Exactly. So offer your actions up to Him. And here's what's crazy about Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection and the saints is that they actually are able to like be completely immersed in a worldly task and be in like deep communion with God, almost in a way that there's like two different things going on within their hearts. Like this is like Teresa of Avila, like the mystical union.
Mother Teresa, dude.
Yeah.
I was just reading a speech she gave at the University of Harvard. She goes up to the stage, she has this little thing, she's reading it. And she's in front of lobbyists, politicians, academics. And there's this deep sense of, I was watching it actually, you can watch it on YouTube where she's giving this talk, serenity. Like this deep sense of peace. Like she possesses God, even though she's in this University of Harvard, she goes up there and she rails them. She's like, everybody talks about how rich America is. America is not rich. Any country that's willing to kill their unborn in the womb is not rich. They're desperately poor. Like this is a woman who's in a very kind of the heart of, let's say, secular world, and at the same time is fully possessing herself and in union with God. She is integrated.
Yeah.
That's
a great example. That's a great example. And this is the goal. So like flow is a state that you can arrive at in the midst of any particular task. That this is what Dr. Kevin majors. But like the saints live, like they achieve this flow state for their entire life. Like their entire life is a continuous state of flow that they're offering back to God.
Yep. Yeah, I love that analogy or that parallel to flow, because you see the pattern as like it's so clear there that is perfectly in line with this idea of leisure, time separate away to receive a pattern, right? Even in taking that space before an action, that's your little Sabbath, right before you perform an action. So you go to a space that is separate and set apart to receive a pattern, and then you do the thing, right? And so psychology is proving this idea, right? And that just alludes to the fact that we're made in the image and likeness of God, right? All those things are coherent. But it is important to know that like there's a design to our nature that participates in it both psychologically and theologically, and that when someone says, "Oh, why you guys go to church on Sunday?" It's like, "Oh, this has deep meaning. It's not just like this thing that out there that was imposed that we should do this special thing." Like this flows, not to use that word again, but this flows through our very nature in how we ought to do everything.
Yeah, that's Ratzinger says that faith, a life of faith, is an all-encompassing reality, right? Like the saints, as you pointed out, again, Ratzinger, which we only quote
like every other 5 minutes.
Yeah. He says that the saint is the highest creative expression of God. Creative, he uses that word creative, right? He's patterned after himself. She is patterned after him. Because the saint is able to live and rest well, but also work well. They're uniquely able to. They found the pattern and they've installed it in their own lives, right? And this is the way that they are the highest creative expression, because they pattern God almost perfectly.
Fractally,
right.
You might say.
Whoa, dude.
Yes. I think that my shadow self is countering this, saying like, okay, well now make it make sense. How does this look like in my everyday life?
Yeah.
I need some like steps and guidelines as to what to do. And I think a helpful place to start is what Pieper ends his book with, which is the philosophical act, and how he talks about how this should be implemented into our life. In that philosophy, right, the love of wisdom, is this kind of separate space that we kind of break out of the worker world, and to contemplate the higher things. And I think that entering into a contemplative life, having time designated to consider, even if it's a moment before, like you said, Deacon Joey, to enter into an almost philosophical act about what you're doing in your life in general, right? To reflect on your life and see how it fits into the whole is necessary. Like, I think this is how this gets implemented. You should examine your life, right? The unexamined life is not worth living, right? Socrates. So we should be reflective, right? Every day we do an examination of conscience. At the end of the day, we should be always watching what we do and see how it participates. And then again, are you just going to think really hard about how this fits, and once you make it make sense, then you're good to go? Or is there a place you receive this, right? This is why there's the call to enter into that philosophical act, to understand how it all fits, but then in continuum with receiving that pattern through prayer, through the Mass, etc.
Yeah, and that's, St. Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, when he's talking about the practice of the presence of God, he'll say, if you notice yourself for a second, which you will because you're a disintegrated fallen human being, like not recognizing that you're in God's presence, not doing this for his glory, not offering it back to him in love, don't freak out. And that would be the temptation to be like, oh, okay, I gotta make sure I'm doing this right. And no, he says just gently recall the presence of God to your mind. And even if you have to do that 1,000 times a day, just gently and peacefully, don't let anything steal your peace.
Right. This is why we have confession.
Exactly.
Right? You go into the confessional and say, this is how I've been disoriented. And then you receive forgiveness, and then you are sealed now, empowered to more properly be oriented. You're obviously going to sin. And then you bring that back to confession. The cycle continues. But the idea is that you find these things in which you're disoriented, that you have these small gods that you've been worshiping, and you gather those things and you tell them to the priest.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up. I was just about to say that, on the one hand, don't beat yourself up because you're a limited being, and you recognize that, you're right. But on the other hand, also, recognize that you are a limited being. That's super important. In fact, that's one of the things that makes something like confession valid, a true act of contrition. I have sinned. I am limited. I have other gods other than the God, right? But also, because God made me out of love, because I was patterned after, as we see, the cosmological view, everything is a gift, I'm also called to turn to you in love, O Lord. What motivates that? It should be love of God, love of community. That's let's say, a fractally integrated act. I've recognized that I'm limited, and I also recognize that I need God. And I recognize that only in him will I become holy, will I become remembered, right? Become one.
Okay, let's to conclude, because this has been a great discussion, let's take all of this theory that we've just been talking about.
It's not all theory, right? Come on, man.
We've been talking a lot about practical stuff too. But let's take the example of somebody who works, I'm thinking of a real hard, somebody who's working a tough job, working in a restaurant in the kitchen and has to work, is barely getting by, doesn't have a lot of free time, is working 6-7 days a week, has to work 12-hour days to the point where when he gets home from work, he's exhausted. Is leisure possible in this man's life? And if so, what does it look like, and how can someone like that experience what we're talking about?
Because some would say that a person that's able to live a leisureful life is a person who has the means to be able to produce. And in fact, Pieper talks about this, right? You don't have to be of middle class or upper echelon to be able to provide a leisureful life. We have the opportunity here in seminary to have that time, and you and your own means are able to do so. But what about that person? What about the person that doesn't? Are they not able to enter into leisure? What would you respond to that? I don't know.
Right. Yeah, it's tough in the particulars because it's a bit like saying how, if you give a scenario, you build up somebody who works a 9-to-5 or a laborious job and say, how does this person find meaning? I don't know. I'm not that person. I can tell you where the pattern is, and then when you embody it, you'll discover it. But that's your journey. That's your vocation to discover that. But it is essential that we take time, right? Obviously, Sunday is mandated, right, for a particular reason. But then that's supposed to be a hint that we should take particular time to enter into prayer, enter into higher level of thinking, enter into discourse and communion with other people. All of those things are essential. You can't just not have those things and then expect, how's the burden going to be lighter? It's well, it's not, because you can't just do that without receiving a way of doing it first.
Yeah, so that's really well said. We can't exactly tell you what it's going to look and feel like exactly for you in your particular case, but we know that the non-negotiables, we know the ingredients that are necessary for a life in which leisure is possible. That is Mass on Sunday, worshiping the God in spirit and truth, the way that he's asked us.
Allow me to take that step back. First of all, you were created by God.
Yeah, knowing that.
Starting from the beginning, creation is a gift. like, although your life may seem like it's difficult and my job sucks and everybody around me sucks and I hate everything, like, hey, take a step back and recognize that there is goodness in reality and that God loves you. So I think like starting there first, like it's a worldview before it's an action, right? Like there's goodness.
Yeah.
One, there's
Yeah.
hope. Two, and then these other things. Like,
Yeah, that's a great point. So mass on Sundays or Saturday night if you have to work on Sundays, you know. A morning offering can be a really powerful thing. The first thing you do in the morning when you wake up is you get down on your knees and you offer your day and everything that you're going to do in your day to the Lord. And then you try to live that out and recall that to your mind as often as you can throughout the day, not freaking out if you forget about it for a few minutes. When you're in the restaurant or washing the dishes or filing papers in the office, like you're just, Lord, I love you and I thank you and I offer this for you. And like as often as you can throughout the day, try to make everything you do an act of love to the Lord. And you're going to forget, and that's okay.
And even if you do forget, it doesn't mean you're not, as we were talking about earlier, Matt, it doesn't mean you're not in a flow state. It doesn't mean you're not worshiping God.
Yeah.
You could be doing stuff, it's like because some people can get scrupulous about this. I've gotten scrupulous about this. Like, oh, I'm not intentionally doing this for God, so I'm sorry. Like, that's not what we're saying. We're saying is that like intentionality is an aspect of it, but just living your life holy is enough.
Yeah, there's such a thing. So like there's a conscious intention and then there's like habitual intention that we talk about, right? So I can consciously be like, okay, God, I do this for you and I'm doing it for you and I'm still thinking of you. And like once you're super holy and like in the seventh mansion of the
basically like where you
mystical
are,
union, that might be what you're experiencing in a much simpler and more profound, natural, organic way. But most of us, it's more of like a habitual intention. Like, Lord, I offered these actions to you, and my mind's going to be immersed in what I'm doing right now, but it's still for you. And as often as I can throughout this time, I'm going to recall you to my mind and tell you I love you and try to do everything for your sake. And then I think periods of daily prayer are essential, more than just the morning offering. Like,
correct. Night prayer, Matt mentioned.
Yeah,
examination.
So examination of conscience. Maybe that's 5, 10, 15 minutes a day that you can set aside to be your little Sabbath, to be the mountain that you climb up to receive the pattern that needs to be a part of our lives if we're going to have any chance of living an integrated existence.
I think another thing too, and Matt, you can add on and we can kind of conclude with more practicals, but like having that dinner. Like have that dinner with your family. Like and it used to be the case where like dinner times were scheduled.
Yep.
Like you get to the table at 6:00. No ends after ends. What is it?
No ifs, ands, or buts.
If, ands, or buts. There we go. Boom about it, right? You do that. Like this is what we do as a family because not just because it's cool and we want to eat a salad and we're trying to eat healthy only, but it's like because we want time with each other because we deserve that.
Yep.
Because justice demands that we have communion.
Yeah. I've tried to implement that into my own family. And we try as often as we can to have those designated times to have meals together for the sake of communion with each other. And that also stems from a broader thought of how am I going to pass down my faith to my kids? And I have to show them the patterns in the little ways in their life so that when then they hear, oh, yes, the Catholic Church requires that you go to Mass every Sunday. It's like, oh, yeah, just the way that mom and dad made us eat meals together all the time. Like it's this flow that happens through them where it doesn't feel implemented and they're like, what is this? It doesn't feel foreign to them. And so I'm trying to integrate that aspect of the pattern into their life, into mine as well, so that everything stays united. And it's kind of a radical challenge, because I understand the critique's like, okay, but not everybody is contemplating Christ on the cross and the unity of the perfect sacrifice every time you're washing dishes. I do sometimes. Like it's a thing. It's a challenge. There's like, this is what it means to be a Christian and to have it embody your whole life is that it radically forms the way you think. Like you got to do better. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
So, it's also one of the things like it has to be motivated by love, back to your point, Deacon Max, that, I'm in the way I engage with my wife, I don't have a list of things I need to do to recognize her pattern so that I participate fully in who she is. Like, I do those things, but the way I describe that is I love my wife. and I have time separate that we spend time together to be in relationship with each other. And so that informs the way I treat my children and treat the rest of my day. And what I do at work is because it's for her, because I love her. All those things have a language of kind of self-offering and beauty and motivation, as opposed to this kind of calculated, like, well, find the pattern, implement it in your life, and that's how you become a good Christian. Like, that's not what I'm saying. It has to be this kind of like this interaction, this encounter with beautiful, right? With the beautiful.
That is awesome, and I think a good place to end. It is love. It's love that has to motivate it all. You said it well. We're talking in complicated terms, but really it's all very simple. It's love. And
we
It's
got to
living a
learn
life
to
of
love.
holiness.
Yeah.
That's what integration. I mean, that's what we're arguing here. Where the world wants to emphasize work, productivity, efficiency, grind, power struggles. We're saying our Lord created us of gift, and He wants us to enter into a life of gift, and that requires leisure, right? And that also requires that our work enter into that schema as well. And so we really enjoyed talking with you. We wish we had more time. We always wish we had more time, especially when we're talking to you, Matt. And we'll probably call you right after just to talk outside of this. But we do have to go here shortly. And I guess we wanted to open up the floor for you. Any concluding remarks? Regarding what you're doing, what you're up to, maybe your own project, and also some departing words regarding this topic.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It was a great discussion. I always like talking to you guys. I have an album out now. It's called The Frame. It's kind of a pseudo-autobiographical work. Various songs about kind of my journey through discovering myself as an artist and what that means and different implications of that. There's also lyrics on my website, matthylom.com, and they have footnotes on them where there's like references to biblical verses or pieces of literature that kind of inspired these particular
cool.
lines. So I spent some time just kind of fleshing through, where the atmosphere in which I created these things. And so they're kind of documented there. That's all I've got going on for now.
Cool, man. Well, we appreciate you.
Yeah,
we always
thank you
appreciate
so much, Matt, for coming.
Yeah, man. I wish you best in your endeavors. As you figure out, as we figure out how to kind of be more integrated, holy people, you in your own marriage and your own work, as a father, and we in our own vocations too. That's what we're striving for. That's what it's all about. To introducing you to the Logos, to being itself, to our Lord Jesus Christ, who brings us together and makes us one in Him.
I just realized I haven't been looking at our listeners probably at all this episode. I've just been looking at Matt's face on my.
That's all right. You're the one that's going to look like an idiot. So, guys, thank you for tuning into this episode of Logos Podcast. We love you guys, and as always, God bless. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, guys.